A penniless nurse was compelled to marry a billionaire on his deathbed, yet when he survived, he fell. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. On a rainy Tuesday night in New York City, a young nurse named Emily Carter walked out of the hospital after finishing a double shift. Her sneakers were soaked through, her hands smelled faintly of antiseptic, and her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of exhaustion. Yet what weighed on her most heavily was not fatigue, but the letter crumpled inside her pocket, a final warning notice from the bank. Her mother's medical bills had drowned her in debt, and every dollar of her paycheck disappeared before she could even count it. Emily never believed in miracles. She believed in hard work, long hours, and sacrifice. But that night, fate had a cruel twist prepared for her. She was stopped by a man in a black suit, waiting under the hospital's awning. His umbrella shielded him from the downpour, but his sharp gaze cut through the rain like glass. "Miss Carter?" he asked, his tone clipped, businesslike. "You will need to come with me. Immediately." Emily froze. "Excuse me? Who are you?" He handed her a sealed envelope with her name written in bold ink. Inside, a legal contract. Her eyes skimmed the words that changed the course of her life forever. Marriage agreement. At first, she thought it was a cruel joke, but the man continued, "My employer, Mr. Alexander Blackwood, requires your presence. Tonight." The name sent a ripple of recognition through her. Everyone in New York knew Alexander Blackwood, the billionaire who had built an empire of luxury hotels, only to fall gravely ill in recent months. Rumors claimed he had mere weeks left to live. Emily's heart pounded. "Why me?" she whispered. The man's voice dropped to a chilling calm. "Because Mr. Blackwood has chosen you to be his wife." Emily's breath caught. The words sounded absurd, impossible. But before she could protest, the man added, "This is not a request. If you agree, your debts will be cleared, and your mother will have access to the best medical care money can buy. If you refuse, well, you know the consequences of unpaid debt." The hospital lights flickered behind her. The rain poured harder, soaking her hair. Emily felt cornered, trapped between duty to her mother and the outrage of selling herself into a cold, loveless marriage. Her hands shook as she stared at the contract. The ink blurred with raindrops. Somewhere inside, she heard her mother's voice frail, trembling. "Do not give up on me, Emily." That was when Emily Carter, a penniless nurse with no future, signed her name onto a marriage contract with a dying billionaire she had never met. What she did not know, what no one could have predicted, was that this cold bargain, this forced vow, would ignite a story of betrayal, redemption, and a love stronger than any contract written on paper. And so, Emily was driven through the stormy night toward the Blackwood estate, unaware that her life was about to change forever. The car ride through the storm felt endless. Emily sat in the back seat, clutching the damp contract with trembling hands. Every streetlight that flashed through the rain-streaked window reminded her of how far she was being taken from the life she knew. She whispered to herself, almost as if to anchor her mind, "This is for Mom. This is for her." At last, the car slowed and turned through iron gates that loomed like sentinels. Beyond them stretched the Blackwood estate, a sprawling mansion that seemed carved out of shadows. The windows glowed faintly against the storm, but the walls towered over Emily with the silence of power and wealth she could never imagine belonging to. The butler opened her door, offering no smile, only a curt gesture to follow. Emily's wet sneakers squeaked across the marble floor of the foyer. Crystal chandeliers hung above, and the air smelled of polished oak and sterile luxury. She felt out of place, like a street sparrow that had flown by mistake into a cathedral. In the grand hall, a man waited. He was tall, thin from illness, his frame cloaked in an expensive robe. His skin was pale, his cheekbones sharp, but his eyes, piercing gray, still carried the command of a man who had once ruled boardrooms and nations of wealth. Alexander Blackwood. Emily froze, her heart racing. She had seen his face in magazines, but never like this, fragile yet terrifying, human yet untouchable. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "So you are the woman who signed away her freedom tonight." Emily swallowed hard. I only agreed because you need money," he cut her off, a bitter smile playing at his lips. "Do not dress it up as charity. We are both desperate, Miss Carter. You need salvation for your debts. I need a wife on paper." The words struck her like a slap, but she said nothing. She remembered the ink bleeding in the rain, her mother's voice, and the truth of her circumstances. Alexander gestured, and the butler brought forward a small velvet box. Inside lay 2 simple wedding bands, plain and cold. He picked up one and placed it on the table between them. "This ring," he said flatly, "is not a promise of love. It is a symbol of contract. You will wear it, stand beside me in public, and play the role of my wife until death releases us. In return, your debts are gone, and your mother will be treated at the finest hospital in the city. Do we have an understanding?" Emily's throat burned. Every instinct screamed to walk away, but the weight of her reality crushed her defiance. Slowly, she nodded. "We do." "Good," Alexander replied. "Then let us get this charade over with." The next morning, under gray skies, they stood in the private chapel of the estate. The ceremony was stripped of joy. There were no flowers, no music, no guests, only a priest murmuring words of union that rang hollow in the cavernous room. Emily wore a plain white dress borrowed from the estate, her hands shaking as she held the ring. Alexander, pale but unyielding, slid the band onto her finger with the detachment of a man signing a business deal. "You may kiss the bride," the priest concluded softly. Alexander leaned forward, his lips brushing her cheek like a ghost of affection, cold and distant. Emily's eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. When the priest left, silence engulfed them. Alexander finally turned, his gaze heavy. "Do not mistake this for anything more than what it is, Mrs. Blackwood. You are here because of convenience, nothing more." Emily lowered her eyes, her hand unconsciously tightening around the ring. It felt heavy, not because of gold, but because of what it represented: her sacrifice, her shame, and the chains of a bargain she could not escape. As the storm outside raged on, Emily Carter took her first steps into a marriage that was never meant to be real, unaware that behind the cold words and the lifeless vows, destiny had already planted its first seeds. The days that followed were not the fairy tale anyone would imagine after a wedding. Emily Carter now lived inside the vast Blackwood mansion, yet every step echoed her isolation. The marble floors were spotless, the chandeliers dazzling, but the silence pressed down like a weight she could not lift. She was not a wife in this house, she was an intruder. Alexander Blackwood kept his distance. His illness confined him to his private wing, a suite of polished wood and muted curtains. The staff obeyed him with rigid loyalty, their eyes cutting through Emily, as if she were a fraud who had stolen a place she did not deserve. Whenever she passed them, whispers followed. Gold digger. Opportunist. The words stung, but she forced herself to stand tall, even when her knees trembled. Her duty was clear. She was to remain by Alexander's side, attend to his needs, and maintain appearances for the world outside. The doctors came and went, their faces grave, their reports hushed. Each evening, Emily sat in the armchair by his bedside, waiting for instructions that rarely came. Alexander barely spoke to her, often staring past her with cold detachment, as if she were a shadow in his dying days. Yet, despite the frost between them, Emily's instincts as a nurse could not be silenced. She noticed the way his hands shook when he tried to lift a glass. She saw the lines of pain etched across his face when he thought no one was looking. Without a word, she began adjusting his pillows, refilling his water, placing a blanket over him when the nights grew cold. One evening, as thunder rolled outside, she found him struggling to sit upright. His pride resisted asking for help, but his body betrayed him. Emily hurried to his side, sliding her arm behind his shoulders to lift him gently. His chest rose against her hand, weak but steady. "You should not exert yourself," she said softly. His eyes flicked to her, guarded, suspicious. "Do not pity me." "It is not pity," she replied, steadying him until he could breathe comfortably again. "It is care. You may not want it, but you need it." For the first time, he did not answer. His gaze lingered, as if searching her face for deceit, but all he found was quiet sincerity. Emily returned to her chair, pretending not to notice that his eyes followed her a moment longer than usual. The nights continued in uneasy silence. Emily passed the time mending small things around the room, sewing a torn cuff on his robe, replacing the flowers in the vase, reading aloud from the newspapers when he pretended not to listen. At first, Alexander scoffed, closing his eyes as though her voice annoyed him. But slowly, imperceptibly, the rhythm of her words became part of the room's pulse, steady as the storm outside. One late evening, when insomnia plagued him, he surprised her by asking, "Why do you do all this? No one is watching. You do not have to pretend when we are alone." Emily looked up from the sewing kit in her lap. "Because that is who I am. Whether someone sees it or not does not change what I believe in." He turned his head, a faint sound escaping his throat that might have been the beginning of a laugh, though it ended as a cough. It startled her more than if he had shouted. She realized she had just witnessed something rare, an unguarded moment from a man who had built walls around his soul. That night, after she helped him lie down again, she slipped the ring off her finger and studied it. To anyone else, it was just a symbol of a cold contract. But to Emily, it had become something different. A reminder of the life she had sacrificed, and the fragile hope that perhaps this arrangement could mean more than survival. As the storm subsided and dawn crept across the horizon, Emily Carter began to sense the faintest shift in the mansion's air. The walls that had once seemed impenetrable were cracking, ever so slightly. And though Alexander would never admit it aloud, the dying billionaire had started to see his penniless bride as something far more dangerous than a contract. He had begun to see her as human. The following weeks unfolded like a fragile truce. Emily Carter moved quietly through the mansion, never demanding, never intruding, yet always present when Alexander Blackwood needed her most. She brought tea when the nights grew restless, read to him when his hands trembled too much to hold the paper, and left the curtains open just enough to let the sunrise spill across his bed each morning. Alexander, though still guarded, began to notice her more. He would watch silently as she adjusted his blankets with meticulous care, or as she hummed softly while arranging fresh flowers in a vase. It was not the grand gestures that unsettled him, but the simplicity of her presence, the way she seemed to carry warmth into rooms long frozen in silence. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Emily sat at a small desk in the corner, sewing a button back onto one of Alexander's robes. Her brow was furrowed, her fingers moving with practiced precision. Alexander studied her quietly, his voice breaking the silence after a long pause. "Why do you bother with such small things?" he asked, his tone more curious than cold. Emily looked up, surprised. "Because details matter. A missing button might not seem important, but it makes life harder. Sometimes it is the little things that keep us going." Alexander leaned back against his pillows, the faintest trace of a smirk on his lips. "You speak as though you believe these small acts can change something." She met his gaze steadily. "I do. Maybe they cannot change the world, but they can change a moment. Sometimes a moment is all we need." Her words lingered in the air long after she lowered her head again. For the first time in weeks, Alexander did not feel entirely like a man waiting to die. The shift deepened one sleepless night, when Emily, sensing his frustration, pulled a worn book from her bag. "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked hesitantly. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Do you think I am a child?" "No," she said with a small smile, opening the book anyway. "But everyone deserves to be reminded of stories, even grown men." Her voice filled the room, low and even, carrying words of distant adventures and forgotten heroes. At first, Alexander scoffed, but soon his breathing slowed, his shoulders eased, and for the first time in months, he drifted into peaceful sleep while someone else kept watch. Emily closed the book quietly, her eyes softening as she realized he trusted her enough to rest. The following morning, when he woke, Alexander caught sight of the book still lying open on the chair beside her. "You stayed," he murmured. "Of course," Emily replied simply. "Where else would I be?" He had no answer, but the silence between them no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like something fragile, forming slowly. Days later, a more startling moment arrived. Emily had been preparing tea when Alexander tried to rise from bed on his own. His strength failed him, and he stumbled. Without hesitation, she rushed forward, catching him before he fell. Her arms wrapped firmly around him, her heartbeat pounding against his frail chest. For a moment, their faces were close enough that she could see the storm of conflict in his gray eyes. Pride, vulnerability, and something else, something unspoken, flashed there. "You should not push yourself," she whispered, steadying him carefully. His voice was rough, barely audible. "You speak as though I am not already slipping away." She held his gaze, her own voice trembling but resolute. "You are still here. That is what matters." For the first time, Alexander did not turn away. He let her guide him back to the bed, his hand lingering in hers a fraction longer than necessary. That night, as Emily placed the plain wedding band on the nightstand, she realized it no longer felt like a chain. Somehow, through quiet acts and unspoken moments, it had begun to carry the weight of something real. And Alexander Blackwood, the man the world believed was too cold to love and too close to death to care, felt the first crack in the fortress around his heart. It terrified him more than his illness ever had. The day of the surgery arrived like a storm that no one could stop. Doctors in crisp white coats filled the Blackwood estate, their expressions grim as they prepared Alexander for the procedure that could either grant him more years or end his life within hours. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear, and every corner of the mansion seemed to hold its breath. Emily Carter stood at the foot of Alexander's bed as nurses wheeled in carts of equipment. Her hands were cold, her pulse unsteady, but her eyes never left his face. She had been trained to remain calm in the face of medical emergencies. But this was different. This was not a patient. This was her husband. Even if their vows had been forged in a contract rather than love. Alexander, pale but composed, caught her gaze. "Do not look at me like I am already gone," he said quietly, his voice carrying the faintest trace of a smirk that could not hide his fear. Emily stepped closer, her fingers brushing his hand. "You are not gone. Not yet. You are still here. And as long as you are here, I will not give up." His gray eyes softened, just for a second. Then the doctors announced it was time. They wheeled him away, leaving Emily standing in the echoing hallway, her heart hollow, and her mind racing. She sank into a chair, clasping her hands together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Hours passed like years. Rain hammered against the tall windows. Thunder growled in the distance, and every minute without news felt like a blade twisting deeper. Emily whispered prayers she was not sure anyone was listening to. She thought of her mother in the hospital bed across the city, depending on her. She thought of the cold contract that had brought her here. And most of all, she thought of the man fighting for his life in the sterile brightness beyond those closed doors. At last, the lead surgeon emerged. His face was weary, but his voice carried something Emily had not expected: hope. "The operation was a success," he announced. "Mr. Blackwood will need time to recover, but he survived." Emily's knees nearly buckled with relief. She pressed her hands over her mouth, tears blurring her vision. Against all odds, the man who had entered her life as a dying billionaire was still alive. When she was finally allowed to see him, Alexander lay pale and weak in the recovery room, but his chest rose and fell steadily. Machines beeped softly around him, monitoring the rhythm of life he had almost lost. Emily pulled a chair to his bedside and sat down, taking his hand in both of hers. "You did it," she whispered. "You fought. You came back." His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment she thought he might not respond. But then his lips curved faintly. "Perhaps I did not do it alone." Emily's tears fell freely now, but she did not let go of his hand. In that quiet room, with the storm outside giving way to dawn, something shifted between them. The contract, the cold vows, the walls of pride, all of it seemed fragile, breakable. Over the next days, as Alexander regained strength, Emily never left his side. She fed him spoonfuls of broth when he was too weak to lift a spoon. She adjusted his pillows through the long nights. She whispered encouragement when he winced in pain. And though he tried to mask it with sarcasm and sharp remarks, Alexander began to lean on her presence in ways he never had before. One evening, as she helped him sit up, he caught her wrist with surprising strength. His voice was rough, but steady. "You should have left when you had the chance. Why did you stay?" Emily's breath caught. She could have said it was her duty, or that the contract bound her. But the truth slipped out instead. "Because I wanted to. Because you matter." Alexander studied her, his gray eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, he released her wrist, his hand lingering against hers as though reluctant to let go. For the first time since their cold wedding, the air between them was no longer filled with pretense. It was filled with something raw, fragile, and undeniably real. Emily Carter had entered this marriage for survival. But as she sat by Alexander Blackwood's side, watching him breathe steadily after defying death itself, she realized that survival was no longer the only reason she stayed. Something far greater had already begun to take root. Alexander Blackwood's recovery was slow but steady. Each morning, sunlight spilled into the grand bedroom that once felt like a tomb. Now it was filled with the sound of quiet footsteps, the rustle of blankets being adjusted, and the low murmur of Emily Carter's voice as she coaxed him to eat or reminded him to take his medicine. The world outside, however, did not remain quiet. News of his survival spread quickly through New York's elite circles. Headlines in glossy magazines declared, "Billionaire heir defies death." Business analysts speculated about his return to power. But along with fascination came gossip, and Emily's name was dragged into every whisper. When society discovered that the penniless nurse was not only living in the mansion but legally married to Alexander Blackwood, the scandal ignited like wildfire. Journalists camped outside the estate gates. Tabloids ran photographs of Emily, painting her as a cunning opportunist who had preyed on a dying man for fortune. Gold digger, schemer, imposter, the words clung to her like poison. One morning, as Emily brought Alexander his tea, she found him holding a newspaper. Her own face stared back at her from the front page, accompanied by cruel headlines. Alexander's expression was unreadable. "They seem to think you are a very ambitious woman, Mrs. Blackwood." Emily froze, the tray trembling in her hands. "I did not ask for any of this. I never wanted their money or their approval." His gray eyes searched her face, as though measuring her words. "Then why did you sign that contract? Why did you stay?" She set the tray down carefully, her voice low but steady. "Because my mother was dying. Because I had no choice. But everything I have done since then has been because I wanted to, not because I was paid." The silence between them grew heavy. For the first time, Alexander did not look at her with suspicion. Instead, his jaw tightened, not in anger, but in frustration at the world outside that refused to see her truth. Later that week, the Blackwood family convened at the mansion. Alexander's relatives, sharp in their tailored suits and colder than the marble floors, confronted Emily directly. His cousin sneered, "We all know what you are after. Do not think surviving this surgery will make Alexander foolish enough to keep you around." Emily's face flushed, but before she could respond, Alexander's voice cut through the room. "Enough." The family turned, startled. Alexander, still weak, but seated with authority, glared at them. "She is my wife. By law, by vow, and by choice. If you cannot respect her, then you do not belong in this house." The room fell silent. For the first time, Alexander had taken her side publicly. Emily's heart pounded, not from fear, but from a fierce wave of gratitude. That night, she sat by his bedside once more. "You did not have to defend me," she said softly. Alexander's gaze lingered on her. "I did, because I know what it is like to be judged unfairly, and because you are not what they say you are." Her chest tightened. For weeks she had carried the weight of shame and insult, but in that moment, with his quiet words, she felt lighter. As days passed, Emily began to notice another change. Alexander no longer dismissed her presence. He asked her about her past, about her childhood, about her dreams beyond the walls of hospitals and debt. She found herself telling him things she had never shared with anyone, how she used to sketch by the river as a girl, how she dreamed of traveling but never could, how she believed kindness mattered, even when the world did not. And sometimes, when she spoke, he simply listened, his gray eyes soft in ways she never thought possible. Still, doubt lingered. Emily often caught herself staring at the wedding band on her finger, wondering if he could ever truly see her as more than a contract. But Alexander Blackwood had already begun to show her the answer, not with declarations, but with actions. One evening, as she tucked the blanket around him, his hand brushed hers. He did not pull away. "Emily," he murmured, her name rough on his tongue, as though it was new to him. "You have given me something I thought I had lost forever, a reason to fight." She held his gaze, her heart trembling, The world outside still called her a gold digger. His family still looked at her with disdain. But in that moment, sitting beside the man who had once been nothing more than a dying billionaire, Emily realized that their bond was no longer built on a contract. It was becoming something real, something the world could not define or destroy. Despite Alexander Blackwood's growing strength, the shadow of doubt still loomed over Emily Carter. The whispers of the outside world echoed in her ears, and even within the walls of the mansion, she felt the sting of suspicion. Servants avoided her eyes, relatives sneered at her presence, and headlines never ceased to brand her as the opportunist who had trapped a billionaire in his weakest moment. One evening, as she prepared to leave Alexander's study after another quiet night of conversation, she placed her hand on the doorframe. "Maybe I should go," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Alexander, seated by the fire, looked up sharply. "Go? Where would you go?" Her voice cracked. "Back to my own life. Back to something simple. I am tired of being called a thief, a gold digger, a fraud. You survived, Alexander. You do not need me anymore." His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something far heavier. He rose slowly, his body still recovering, but his presence commanding. "Do you think I survived because of them?" he asked, his tone rough. "Do you think the doctors, the family, or the fortune kept me alive? Number. It was you." Emily's breath caught, but her doubt pressed on. "Even if that is true, the world will never see it that way. You will always be Alexander Blackwood, and I will always be the penniless nurse who signed a contract." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Then let them talk, let them sneer. I do not care about the world's approval. What I cannot accept is you walking away." Her chest tightened as the firelight flickered between them. The truth was clear in his voice, raw and unguarded. But fear gnawed at her heart. If she stayed, she risked being broken by the weight of his world. If she left, she risked breaking them both. Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head. "I cannot do this, Alexander. Not like this." Before he could stop her, she slipped from the study, her footsteps echoing down the long hallway. The ring on her finger felt heavier than ever, not as a chain of duty, but as a bond she was terrified of believing in. Behind her, Alexander stood in silence, his jaw clenched. For a man who had built an empire, fought off death, and faced the cruelty of his own family, the thought of losing Emily Carter was the first battle he truly feared he could not win. Emily Carter's absence from Alexander Blackwood's side did not go unnoticed. Within days, the tabloids swarmed with new headlines. One article claimed she had disappeared because she had gotten what she wanted, his money. Another spread a rumor that she had been secretly meeting a lover, while Alexander lay on his deathbed. Lies multiplied like wildfire, and with each new headline, the Blackwood family pressed harder to have the marriage annulled. The cruelest blow came when a glossy magazine published photographs of Emily leaving the hospital late at night, carrying a file of medical documents. The story twisted the truth, claiming she had been blackmailing Alexander with private information about his condition. The whispers grew into accusations. She was a fraud, a manipulator, a woman who had preyed on a vulnerable man for fortune. When Alexander saw the article, fury unlike anything he had felt in years surged through him. He summoned his family to the grand hall, his voice sharp and unyielding despite the weakness that still lingered from his surgery. "You will not speak another word against my wife," he declared, his gray eyes blazing. "You spread lies because you are afraid. Afraid that a woman without wealth or pedigree could mean more to me than all your empty titles." His cousin scoffed. "You cannot possibly mean this. She trapped you. She is nothing." Alexander rose to his feet, his hand braced on the polished oak table, his voice cutting like steel. "She is not nothing. She is the reason I am alive. While you all waited for my fortune to pass into your hands, she fought for me. She stayed when I had nothing left to give. And you call her a gold digger? You insult me when you insult her." The room fell silent, the weight of his words echoing against the high ceilings. For the first time, Alexander's family could not meet his eyes. That evening, Alexander made a decision. He ordered his driver to take him into the city, despite his lingering weakness. At a press conference swarmed by flashing cameras, he stood before the world. His voice carried strength that defied his fragile frame. "You have all asked who Emily Carter is. he began, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "She is not a thief. She is not a fraud. She is my wife. And every cruel word written about her is a lie. If you want to know the truth, it is this. I owe her my life. She gave me hope when even I had none. And if the world wishes to mock me for loving her, let it. Because I would rather be mocked for love than praised for a heart of stone." The cameras flashed, the reporters shouted questions, but Alexander said no more. He turned and left, his declaration ringing louder than any denial could. Somewhere across the city, Emily saw the broadcast on a small television in the hospital waiting room. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears blurred her vision. For the first time since she had signed that contract in the rain, she realized that Alexander Blackwood was no longer protecting her out of duty. He was fighting for her because he had chosen her, because he loved her. The night after Alexander Blackwood's public declaration, the storm between him and Emily Carter finally began to calm. She returned to the mansion quietly, her steps hesitant as she crossed the marble foyer that had once felt so hostile. But this time, instead of whispers and cold stares, the staff bowed their heads respectfully. Word of Alexander's defense had spread, and the weight of judgment was already shifting. Emily found him in the garden at dawn, wrapped in a heavy coat, watching the first light break over the horizon. He looked tired, but stronger, his posture no longer that of a man waiting for death. When he turned and saw her, his lips curved into something rare and genuine, a smile meant only for her. "You came back," he said softly. Her throat tightened. "I saw what you did. You stood in front of the whole world and defended me. You did not have to do that." "Yes," Alexander replied, his gray eyes steady. "I did, because the truth is simple, Emily. I cannot imagine this life without you. Not as a contract, not as a caretaker, but as my wife. My real wife." He reached into his pocket and drew out the plain gold band that had once symbolized only a cold agreement. Dropping to one knee on the frosted grass, he held it out to her again. "This ring began as a bargain," he said, his voice raw with sincerity. "But now it is my vow, not to wealth, not to duty, but to you. Emily Carter, will you stay by my side not because you have to, but because you choose to?" Tears streamed down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. At last she whispered, "Yes, Alexander. This time, yes." Oh. He slipped the ring onto her finger once more, but it no longer felt heavy with shame. It felt light, like a promise finally fulfilled. As he rose, she wrapped her arms around him, and for the first time, they kissed not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as two souls who had fought through storms to find each other. In the days that followed, the noise of scandal began to fade. The world that once mocked them now marveled at their unlikely love story. His family, silenced by his resolve, could no longer deny the truth. And Emily, once the penniless nurse forced into a cold bargain, stood proudly beside Alexander, not as an imposter, but as the woman he had chosen. Their story, born from desperation and doubt, had transformed into something far greater. It was proof that love, when genuine, could break through the walls of wealth, prejudice, and fear. And so, against all odds, a contract written in desperation ended as a vow written in the heart, forever binding Emily Carter and Alexander Blackwood, not by circumstance, but by love.